So I think I got into science because I know some people are like very into it because they got interested in nature, but for me I was someone who liked to compile lists of things, and I like to collect data on things. And that would be like cricket averages or going out and counting number of birds or something like that. And so I used to like compiling data, and of course that's then makes it very amenable to thinking about the world in terms of measuring things and collecting information, which is really at the heart of science. And then why evolution? Well, because you're trying to explain the diversity of life, and there's such enormous differences between species, and trying to understand why one species is different from another species is really amenable to analysing data about those species. So that's why I got particularly into evolution. So my day is a mixture of different things because I both teach and I do research. So a typical day might involve me giving a class for students and then coming back answering emails, which seems perennial, but also then working on some research, and that might be writing a paper or doing some analysis or popping into the lab to check an experiment's working okay, or talking with a student about their field research. So it's a mixture of different elements that involves both computer work and lab work and analysing and writing. I think the most interesting thing is when you are coming up with an idea. I think people don't realise that science is a really creative process, and the creation comes in with thinking up an idea, and then the cool part is then going ahead and testing that idea. And that's an idea you've come up with in your head, but you can then test it in a scientific manner, and that's the most scientifically interesting part of my job. I think the most interesting thing that I've worked on is to do with thermoregulation. So that's basically able to control the body temperature of birds, and particularly the work that I've done showing that bird bills are used by birds to help both heat up and cool down particularly. And so showing how that property of bird beaks, which is not one that people really appreciate very much, is really important in having shaped their evolution. I think from personal perspective, I was the president of the Australasian Evolution Society, so from a prestige perspective that was really interesting. I'm also now the editor-in-chief of an evolutionary journal, and that's really interesting because you get to see other people's research come in every day, and you see sort of the vast number of different topics that people are working on, and usually all pretty interesting stuff. In terms of my scientific research, I think I've had the most enjoyment out of all the work I've done where I've applied evolutionary trees to try and understand why species are different from each other. So you can by understanding the evolutionary relationships of species, you can then understand why they've evolved particular characteristics. So any of my work in that area has been the stuff that I've found most personally interesting. So in a sense, I'm working on evolutionary processes, so there's an inherently historical aspect to my research. That said, there's increasing use of evolutionary thinking and evolutionary theory to try and understand real world problems. So the work that I've been doing with my student Uday on using evolutionary trees to predict medicinal potential in plants, in previously undiscovered species of plants, is an application of how you can use the knowledge of the past to try and both predict the present and predict the future. So there can be a contemporary aspect to something that is inherently a historical subject. So evolution is the topic that answers the big why questions in biology. And why are things the way they are? Why are we the way they are? and understanding how life on the planet has arisen in its present form. So a lot of what I do is getting to understanding the overall patterns of diversity and understanding things like animal behaviour, particularly where when you watch a natural history documentary, when you want to understand, well, why is that animal behaving in the way it is, the explanations that are offered there are the kind of work that I do, trying to understand what is going on with those animals. So it's really just that broad perspective of understanding that evolution offers as a framework to biology. Yeah, so when we do work in the lab, it's not all lab coats and chemicals and things like that. What we're doing in our group is mostly working on insects and insect behaviour. And insects are reasonably easy to keep in a lab, and they're reasonably easy to observe. They don't tend to sort of be difficult to manage. And so a lot of what we're doing is observing behaviour. For example, we might be interested in how insects choose which other insect to mate with. So I've had students working on things like bark beetles and moths and fruit fly in the lab, where you set up little arenas for them to behave in. It's a bit like those old-fashioned type things where you put two animals together in a jar and see whether they eat each other. Not quite. We're not looking at whether they're eating each other, but we're looking at why does this insect choose this particular other insect to mate with and not the other one that we offer them, and what are the characteristics of this particular individual that makes them more attractive to the other individual. So a lot we're doing is setting up little arenas or wind tunnels and looking at insect behaviour in the lab. So obviously we're working on insects, but the same kind of principles could be applied to understanding human behaviour. Not that we were saying that, you know, a moth being attracted by the pheromone produced by a female is necessarily the kind of thing that humans do, but fundamentally what we're trying to understand is core principles of behaviour, and a lot of those core principles will be shared with humans. For example, I had a student working on sawflies. Now these are aggregations, they exist for most of their life as aggregations of what look like caterpillars, although they're not true caterpillars, on gum trees. And they live in clumps. They're sometimes known as spitfires, and they're really common around Melbourne. They live in clumps on the tree, and every evening at dusk they head out on the tree towards the leaves of the tree to feed. And there's consistent leaders among these sawflies. Even amongst these really primitive animal societies, there are leaders that determine where they're going to go and at what time they're going to set off. And what my student found was that if you start removing the leaders from the group can't cope as well. They need the leaders to be able to tell them what to do. And so it's fascinating that even in such a simple insect, that they have this societal structure that benefits from having a mixture of leaders and followers. And so you can see how these aspects of our society as humans are then actually reflected in much simpler animal societies. So I think if you want to become a scientist, two things are really good. First of all, read, in the sense of read popular science books. Not only are they interesting, but they'll also give you a good idea about how to write and think about science and what makes good communication in terms of science. And that's a really fundamental part of science, being able to communicate your ideas. The second thing is make use of any opportunities you get to do volunteer work, even if it's just a sort of a day helping out at a museum or something like that. Anything that gives you experience and subjects you to new kinds of skills that you might develop, be it in helping out with some computer data analysis, or going out and helping someone do some field work for a day in the field or something like that. just make use of those experiences, because they will help shape your thinking about science and make you into a better scientist.